Stepdad takes my mom and his kids on a vacation without even telling me. Alone, abandoned, and angry, I decide to stay with my dad, and that's when everything spirals completely out of control. I'm 16 years old, just a regular high school guy trying to navigate life like anyone else my age. My mom married my stepdad, Eddie, 2 years ago. She's 40, he's 42, and let me just say, this whole situation has been a wild ride. My parents never tied the knot. I wasn't the result of a grand love story but a short fling after college. It was supposed to fizzle out after a few months. But then, life happened. My mom got pregnant with me, and everything changed. She decided to keep me, despite the odds, and my dad chose to stay involved too. The result? Shared custody. I bounced between their houses, splitting my time equally. 1 month with mom. 1 month with dad. Back and forth. It's been this way my whole life. And, honestly, I love them both. They've sacrificed so much for me. I mean, imagine this, both my parents stayed in the same city for years, just so I wouldn't have to deal with a complicated commute. I didn't know the extent of their sacrifices back then, but now? It's crystal clear. Career advancements passed up, opportunities declined, all for my sake. My mom? She gave up potential relationships too. She told me about men who adored her, men she could have built a life with, but she turned them away. She wanted to focus on me, to raise me without the complications of marriage and balancing work, love, and motherhood. At least, that's what she says. Now, here's where Eddie comes into the picture. My mom married him 2 years ago, and let's just say he's not exactly the dream stepdad. It's not that he's mean or cruel. It's weirder than that. Eddie doesn't like me, and he doesn't even try to hide it. I don't know why. I've never given him a reason to hate me. But it's clear as day, he doesn't want me around. And trust me, when a grown man silently resents a teenager, it's impossible not to notice. He doesn't yell or insult me, he just pretends I don't exist. Imagine living in a house where someone turns their face away every time you walk into a room. Where someone deliberately avoids acknowledging your presence. That's my life with Eddie. At first, I thought maybe I'd done something to upset him. I asked my mom about it. She brushed it off, saying he was just adjusting to the idea of having me around. Apparently, before me, he only dated women without kids. But here's the kicker, Eddie has 2 sons of his own, a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. Their mom tragically passed away in an accident after the younger one was born. And it's not even like I'm around all the time. Remember, I split my time equally between my parents. So why the hostility? Why treat me like a ghost? I tried to be patient. I tried to adapt. But after months of cold shoulders and silence, I realized this wasn't a phase. This was just Eddie. After a year of dating, he proposed to my mom, and they got married. Soon after, Eddie moved in with his sons. Now the whole family dynamic shifted, and not for the better. His kids? Just as distant as their dad. They barely spoke to me, and I could tell they'd been coached to keep their distance. Living in that house felt like walking on eggshells. For years, I endured it. The silence. The isolation. The unspoken tension. And all the while, I wondered, what had I done to deserve this? Before Eddie and my mother tied the knot, their lives were separate, and for good reason. Eddie's mother was gravely ill, so she stayed with him, but once he married my mom, he made the choice to move her in with his sister, trusting she'd be cared for. Eddie moved into our home with his children, blending families in theory, but in practice, it felt more like I'd been cast in a silent film where I was the invisible character. Have you ever been in a house full of people who pretend you don't even exist? That was my life. Every interaction, or lack thereof, cut deep, leaving me feeling like some kind of criminal. But for what crime? To this day, I have no idea what I did to deserve their icy indifference. Years went by, and nothing changed. It didn't matter how much time passed, Eddie and his kids never acknowledged me. Even though I got used to the silence, it never stopped hurting. Every visit to my mother's house was like preparing for battle. I'd brace myself, knowing full well the only conversations I'd have would be with her. She was my only ally in that house, and even she wouldn't stand up to Eddie. I tried pleading with her to address the situation, but her responses were always the same, vague, evasive, and ultimately, disheartening. "There are personal reasons I can't tell you," she'd say, as if that would make me feel any better. She even admitted she understood my feelings, but urged me to suck it up for her sake. When I pushed back, her tone shifted, and she accused me of being ungrateful. "I've made so many sacrifices for you," she'd say, her voice trembling with emotion. "Can't you just let this go?" It stung every time. I didn't want to hurt her feelings, so I stopped pushing, even though I was drowning in resentment. I didn't dare tell my father about any of this. He and my mom had very different parenting philosophies, and I knew he'd go nuclear if he found out. The last thing I wanted was for him to fight for full custody or start a family war. So, I kept quiet, pretending everything was fine. Eddie and my mom have now been married for 2 years, and it's been 3 years total of this silent treatment from their side. 3 years of walking on eggshells, biting my tongue, and swallowing my pride. But last month, something happened that shattered my fragile tolerance. I was spending the month at my mother's house during my summer break. Eddie and his kids were as cold as ever, and I was already in a bad place mentally, dealing with fights with my school friends. Then, one morning, I woke up to an empty house. The night before, everything had been the usual, awkward silences, whispers I wasn't included in, the general atmosphere of exclusion. But the next morning, they were all gone. Panic set in as I called my mother to find out what was going on. When she finally answered, she casually explained that she and Eddie had taken the kids on a week-long trip and left me behind to look after the house. I was stunned. Was I just some glorified house sitter now? She didn't even ask if I was okay with this, she just assumed I'd do it. I told her flat out that this wasn't okay. If she wanted someone to guard the house, she should have invested in better security, not tricked me into it. What hurt the most wasn't just being left out of the trip, it was the lack of basic courtesy. They hadn't even mentioned their plans to me beforehand. Sure, as a high schooler, I could have enjoyed having the house to myself. I might have invited some friends over and had some fun, but I was too angry and hurt to even think about that. Besides, I wasn't in the mood to entertain anyone. The fights with my friends had already left me feeling isolated, and this betrayal from my family only made it worse. I told my mother she owed me an apology, but before I could finish, the call disconnected. That's when it hit me. I was done. Done with the silence, the neglect, and the feeling of being invisible. Something had to change. Waking up to an empty house is disorienting, but when you realize no one even bothered to tell you they'd be gone, it's a gut punch. That morning, the silence screamed louder than any confrontation could. It wasn't just the absence of my mother, her husband, and his kids, it was the absence of basic respect. So, when I finally got her on the phone, I let her know how hurt I was. But instead of understanding or even acknowledgement, I was met with dismissal. She brushed it off, claiming I was making a big deal out of nothing. Her words stung, but what hurt more was how quickly she ended the call. No resolution. No apology. Just a cold get over it before the line went dead. I tried to call her back, hoping we could talk like we used to, but my calls went unanswered. A text followed instead, cold and distant. "I'm trying to enjoy my trip. I'll talk to you later." That was it. That was the moment I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't going to wait in that empty house, stewing in loneliness and anger. I packed my things, locked up the house, and did what she always did. I left the keys under the potted plant. It felt ironic, using her own habit against her, but I didn't care. My destination was clear, my dad's place. When I arrived, his surprise was evident. He hadn't expected me back so soon. After all, I was supposed to stay with my mother until the end of the month. But I couldn't stomach another day of that neglect. As we sat down, I spilled everything. The words came rushing out, like water bursting through a dam. I told him about Eddie, my mom's husband, and how he trained his kids to ignore me. His passive-aggressive behavior wasn't just irritating, it was dehumanizing. I couldn't even pinpoint what I'd done to deserve it, which made it all the worse. My mom's indifference to the whole situation only compounded my frustration. She'd repeatedly defended Eddie, saying he had his reasons. But what reasons? No one would tell me, leaving me to feel like a ghost in my own home. I tried to rationalize it, reminding myself of the sacrifices she always mentioned, how much she'd given up for me. But those words had started to feel like a leash, keeping me tethered to a situation that drained me. After recounting all this to my dad, I broke down. Tears streamed down my face as I realized just how much I'd been holding in. My relationship with my mom wasn't always like this. There was a time when I felt like I mattered to her. But since Eddie entered the picture, everything changed. I became invisible, a mere inconvenience in her new life. My dad listened patiently, his face etched with concern. When I was done, he leaned forward and said one thing: "I'll handle it." He didn't elaborate, didn't rail against my mother or Eddie. He just reassured me that I didn't have to bear this burden anymore. He promised I could stay with him, no strings attached, and if I ever decided to go back to my mother, it would be my choice, but he wouldn't recommend it. His calm, steady support was like a lifeline, pulling me out of the emotional quicksand. Over the next few days, I settled into life at my dad's place. I didn't try to contact my mom, and she didn't reach out to me either. The silence spoke volumes. It was as if she'd erased me from her life entirely. 5 days passed before my phone finally rang, her name flashing on the screen. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she was calling to apologize, to check on me. But the second I answered, her voice hit me like a slap. She was screaming, her words tumbling over each other in a tirade of blame. It took me a moment to process what she was saying. The house had been robbed. Their television and other expensive items were gone, and somehow, it was all my fault. She didn't care that I had tried to call her, that I'd left the house responsibly. None of that mattered. To her, I was the scapegoat, the easy target for her frustration. After her yelling finally subsided, she confronted me, and I didn't hold back. I told her how unhappy I was with the way she'd been treating me. I explained how I tried reaching out multiple times after she hung up on me, but she refused to take my calls. Her response? She said I could have just texted her instead. Sure, she had a point, but I was too mad to do that. I thought it was obvious I was upset, painfully clear, even. So why on earth would she expect me to stick around? Our argument escalated quickly. She insisted I should have stayed at home, no matter how angry or hurt I felt. To her, this was about safety. She said she trusted me, counted on me. But here's the thing, I never asked her to rely on me. I'd done my best to make it crystal clear I wasn't staying. I wasn't going to be left alone in that house. And when she ignored my calls, I left. Simple. Now, she wanted me to face the consequences of her choices, not mine. How was that fair? But it didn't stop with her. Eddie, the man who hadn't spoken to me in years, finally opened his mouth, only to yell at me. He called me careless, blamed me for everything. Then, out of nowhere, he dropped this bombshell. He'd always known I'd ruined them. What did that even mean? We barely spoke. How could he draw that conclusion when he didn't know me at all? The chaos spread like wildfire. My parents started fighting. My dad took my side, blaming my mom for what happened. She, of course, pinned it all on me. And now she's demanding that my dad cover the damages. Her reasoning? If he was defending me, he should also foot the bill. The entire situation spiraled out of control, and I didn't know what to do. My mom wanted an apology, not just for herself, but for her entire family. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. At the same time, I didn't want her pestering my dad anymore. It felt like I was stuck between two impossible choices. Update 1: 2 weeks have passed since the fallout, and the dust hasn't exactly settled. But in that time, some shocking truths have come to light. First, I finally figured out why Eddie hated me so much. As it turns out, it wasn't just because of what happened recently, it went way deeper. Apparently, back when Eddie and my mom first started dating, Eddie had asked her if his ailing mother could move in with them. She'd said no, claiming she wasn't comfortable with the idea of living together so soon. But instead of being upfront about her feelings, she blamed me. This was just 3 months into their relationship, a relationship I already thought was moving too fast. Eddie had made it clear his mom had a full-time nurse, so her physical care wasn't the issue. She just needed emotional support, a family around her. But my mom shut that down. She didn't want the added baggage and used me as a scapegoat. She lied to Eddie, saying I was the problem. She painted me as some unmanageable, rebellious kid who scared off every man she'd ever dated. According to her, I was desperate to reunite my parents and would stop at nothing to sabotage her relationships. It didn't stop there. My mom even claimed I'd made cruel remarks about Eddie's family. She told him I'd called his mother a useless burden and that if she ever moved in, I'd make her life miserable. She also said I referred to his kids as little evil goblins who'd ruin our family dynamic. None of this was true. I'd never said anything like that. It's not who I am. But Eddie believed her. Why wouldn't he? She was his partner, and he trusted her word over anything else. From that moment on, Eddie avoided me completely. He wanted nothing to do with me, all because of her lies. I only found out the truth recently, after Eddie started pressuring my mom to cut ties with me entirely. He thought it was the only solution. When she refused, the truth finally came out. Now, they're living separately. Eddie couldn't handle the betrayal. He'd spent years resenting me, thinking I was the problem, only to discover it was all a fabrication. My mom lied to protect herself, but in doing so, she destroyed our relationships. And now? I'm left picking up the pieces of a life shattered by her deceit. The truth hit me like a freight train. It wasn't me she despised, it was her refusal to let his ailing mother move in with us. My father laid it bare in his email, unraveling the web of deceit. He explained that if my mother had simply been honest, told him she couldn't handle caring for a sick person, he would have arranged for his sister to share the responsibility. But instead, she chose to spin a vile story about me, a story so twisted that he believed it without question, leading him to mistreat me for years. That email came with an apology. He begged for my forgiveness, acknowledging the pain he had caused me. Yet, I haven't replied. Not because I'm holding a grudge, but because I'm still processing it all. My mind craves clarity, free from the chaos this revelation has unleashed. For years, my mother thrived in her role as the puppeteer, orchestrating lies that benefited her perfectly. She told my father that I was a troublemaker at school, feeding him tales of my supposed misdeeds. And because we barely spoke, he never uncovered the truth, that I was just a normal kid, far from the delinquent she portrayed me to be. Her cover stayed intact because she knew how to exploit trust. My father never doubted her, and I bore the brunt of her manipulation. She's a master manipulator, a twisted lady, as much as it pains me to admit. But the tides have turned. My father, armed with the truth, is now filing for full custody. And my mother? She's spiraling, claiming she only wanted us to be a happy family. But how can you build happiness on a foundation of lies and betrayal? You can't. Her actions shattered any chance of a family. Then there's Eddie. He's filing for divorce. I learned about it through my mother's desperate texts to my father, begging him to intervene, to fix this. She's panicking now that her web of lies has unraveled, but what does she expect? After everything, how can she think anyone would take her side? For years, she allowed Eddie and his family to treat me like dirt, feeding them falsehoods about who I was. All for her own benefit. I once prayed no one would ever endure what I did at the hands of their own mother. But now, I pray for strength, for myself, to heal and move forward. I've blocked her everywhere. No calls, no messages. I refuse to let her back into my life. I loved her, truly. I endured so much because I wanted her to be happy. But she didn't love me the same way. She put her happiness above everything, even her own son. That's over now. I won't sacrifice myself for her anymore. And then, the moment came, Eddie officially filed for divorce. It's all anyone in the family circles and their mutual friends can talk about. My cousins send me screenshots of her social media, melodramatic posts, sad quotes plastered for the world to see. Does she think those will fix this? Does she believe those words will undo years of damage? She built this grave with her lies, and now she must lie in it. Months later, the storm settled. My father won full custody of me. The battle was long and grueling. My mother fought hard, but with the mountain of evidence against her, she stood no chance. Her lawyer tried to drag the case out as much as possible, but it was a futile attempt. I'm finally free. Free from her manipulations, her lies, her toxicity. Now, I live with my dad, the custodial parent, and I have no obligation to see her unless I choose to. She's allowed visitation, but what's the point? I don't want to see her. I don't want to talk to her. I've started piecing my life back together, reconnecting with friends, rediscovering who I am beyond her shadow. For the first time in years, I'm hopeful. The road ahead feels bright, free of her darkness. I'm ready to move forward.